Hi guys, in this video I talk about the this keyword. On the left I have a class named car. This defines two member variables named speed and isLightsOn. I also implement the Tostring method that returns a string representation of the class. It simply concatenates a string with the name of each member variable followed by the value in each member variable. On the right, I have a class named program. This declares the main method, and there I can run some test code. Now let's implement the getter and setter methods for this class. I start out with the setter method for the int speed member variable. I declare it as public. It's a setter, so it doesn't return anything. It's called setSpeed, and I pass in a single, or I define a single parameter named speed. Now, if I were to write speed equals speed, this will give me an error, or at least a warning, but it results in a runtime error. The problem is here that I simply assign the value in the parameter to itself. I never access the member variable. So if I want to access the member variable, I have to access it from the current object. And this is where this is really useful. Now I can write this.speed. This refers to the current object. And when I do this.speed, speed is the member variable of the object. If I write it without this, it refers to a local variable if it exists. So in any method, the local variable always takes precedence over the member variable. Let's take a look at this when we implement the getter method. I write get public int get speed, and here I return just speed. Now by not writing this time, it defaults to the member variable because this is the only variable that exists here that is named speed. With setSpeed, I had two variables. I had the local variable with a parameter and the member variable. So if I don't write this in front here, it defaults, it prefers basically or defaults to the parameter. Here I don't have it, so it's the same if I write this.speed or just speed. This is optional here. Now let's take a look at another example. Let's implement the setter method for the lights on. So set lights on. I pass in a boolean is lights on. And here again, if I don't write this, it would assign it to itself. It would not have any effect. So I do this dot is lights on to target the member variable equal is lights on. And so this accesses the member variable, and now whatever is passed into the setter method, it's assigned to the member variable. Now to be complete, let's also implement the getter method. In this case, it's a boolean, so I call it isLightsOn and return the member variable isLightsOn. Again, this is optional in this case because there's no confusion between a local variable and the member variable. So let's create an instance of a car here. I call this car, call the default constructor, and this returns an object of the car, and now I have the object. When I access this object and say set speed and set the speed to 5, this is the variable here that I named car. When I go to the method, now I'm inside the car variable. I don't have access to this variable car. I cannot say car here, right? Car is not defined in this context. So this refers to the current variable that I'm operating on. In this case, it would be the car variable. Now if I create a second car, race car, should be race car, not cart, and I call race car dot set speed 100. When I go to this method here, now this refers to race car because this is where I called the method on. So this is always the current object where the method was called on. Now, if this is still confusing to you, let's see how this actually works. I define a static method. So that is a static method that does not operate on any object. It simply belongs to the class. And I call this, it's a void method, and I call it setSpeed. And as a first argument, I expect a car object. So I define a parameter for this, and I define a second parameter, speed. And here I do car.speed equals speed. Now let's create car2. And here I call the static method. So I have to call it on the class. So I call class.setSpeed. I pass in car2, and the speed I set to 15. So the car dot is simply saying where this method is located. It's located in the class car, so it belongs to the class. But I don't need an object for it. Now that I call setSpeed and I pass in car2 here with 15, now this object references car2, and when I do car.speed, it updates the car object. So this is simply calling a method with two arguments, right? The first one and the second one. 15 is assigned to speed. Car2 is assigned to the car variable here. Now I could name this differently as well. If I go refactor, rename, let's say I call this underscore this. Now car2 is assigned to this, and here I do this.speed equals speed. Now if I would not do this, I would simply assign speed to itself, right? I would completely ignore this object. But by writing underscore this, I assign it to the first argument that is passed in, which is the current object here that is passed in as first argument. So that is the same here, except that this is not explicit. This is really implicit. It's the current object that is being passed to the method, but we just don't see it. It's hidden by the compiler to kind of make the code cleaner. Because you can see if we write car.setSpeed, it's much easier than writing capital car.speed passing car in 15. This is kind of programming in the old context where we don't have objects, where we don't have really classes, where we just have a bunch of functions and we just pass variables around. Now with object-oriented programming, we always call the methods on an object. And so the object is always being passed in, but it's implicit, we don't see it, but we can always access it with the this keyword. So this method here, the static method, passing this in, is essentially the same than what is happening with the setSpeed method here. I hope you better understand now what this means and how it is used. Again, typically you don't need to worry about it, but if you have a local variable that is named the exact same way as one of the member variables, then you use this to distinguish between the two, either the member variable or the local one. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.